In this video, we're going to test how well Adobe Photoshop runs on this MacBook Pro 13-inch running the M1 chip. We're also going to compare it to the top of the line 16-inch MacBook Pro for some of the speed tests. And then at the end, we're going to throw some really heavy tasks at it that maybe I can't even finish them, but I'm curious to see what the limitations are and what it can handle. Hey Cafe crew, Colin Smith here from PhotoshopCAFE.com. Today we're testing Photoshop on the M1 chip on the new Apple 13-inch MacBook Pro. So the one we're running here is pretty much the base level. It has 8 and 8, so it has 8 cores and 8 gigs of memory. So there's two versions of Photoshop we're going to be testing on here. The first one is the native version, which there's a public beta available right now that works on the M1. And there's a few features missing. I'll list the features on the screen, but the key features that are missing are the content aware tools, the healing tools, and camera raw, amongst a lot of other smaller features. And for those missing tools, we can actually take the regular version for Mac of Photoshop, the Intel version, and run it through Rosetta. All of that happens seamlessly. So we're going to be doing tests on both the M1 and Rosetta. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the beta that works on the M1 from Adobe. So to do that, what you want to do is log into your Adobe Creative Cloud account up the top there. Make sure you click on Updates, and if you go down to the bottom here, you'll see Beta Apps. Click on Beta Apps, you'll see Photoshop Beta. So now if you're not using a chip that's running on Apple Silicon, you won't see that beta, so it's only going to be shown for the systems it's going to work on. And then we just simply click Install. And once it's installed, we can click to open it, or we can just open it down here. Notice the icon's a little bit different. We have this Adobe Photoshop Beta icon versus the regular Photoshop icon. So let's just launch it right now. Apart from the flash screen, everything is going to look exactly the same. Okay, so I've got a series of tests that I'm going to perform. Now this MacBook Pro is a beast. It's a 24 gigahertz, 8-core i9 processor. It's running 64 gigs of RAM, and it's also running the AMD Radeon Pro 5500M, which has 8 gigs of video memory. So this is a beast of a machine. It's the top of the line that Apple makes right now. Technically, this little 13-inch shouldn't even be boxing in the same league as this 16-inch. So it's going to be really interesting to see what it can do. So this is an illustration that I created inside of Photoshop, and you can see there's a lot of layers. So it's not a huge file, but it's a very deep file. And if we have a look in the layers, we can see that this has 74 layers. So now we're going to test how fast it can export all of those layers to individual JPEG files at 70% compression. Now I'm going to use the stopwatch here on my iPhone to time it. Okay, so the beast here, the 16-inch beast, was able to export this at 15.26 seconds. The 13-inch MacBook Pro did this in 14.3 seconds. So this actually did it faster than the 16-inch. But then I also tested on Rosetta, which was a little bit slower, was 22 seconds. So I wanted to test the speed, so I created an action to generate 300 gradient map layers. And I run it on both the machines, and the 16-inch MacBook Pro took 15 seconds. The 13-inch running the M1 only took 13.9 seconds, so it was a second faster. Okay, so then I created an action. And in this action, I did a number of tasks. I opened the image, I duplicate the layer, apply a blur, change the blend mode, change the opacity, apply a curves adjustment layer, then merge them all together and save them out at 70% JPEG quality. I ran this on 298 photos. The 16-inch MacBook Pro did this in 1 minute and 14 seconds. The 13-inch MacBook Pro, 43 seconds. And running on Rosetta, 1 minute and 9 seconds. So clearly it was faster on the M1, but even Rosetta ran this task faster than the MacBook Pro 16. Numbers tell you one thing, but the numbers don't tell you about the experience. And I noticed for things like smudging or using the brush tools, it was very snappy and actually more responsive than the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So don't rush out and sell your MacBook Pro 16-inch just yet, because this is where things are going to change. So far we're working on smaller files because this only has 8 gigs of memory. So I'm bearing that into account. The top of the line one available right now only has 16. As soon as I get my hands on it, I'll run a test and compare it. But things start to change significantly when we move into larger files. In fact, we are going to start moving into some files that an 8 gig machine should not even be able to handle. And typically if you had a machine with 8 gigs of RAM, I wonder if it would. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up a large file. So let's open it now. The file that we are loading right now is a 3.6 gigabyte on the drive, 9,445 pixels by 5,763 pixels. So that's basically 10K. So 31 by 20 inches at print resolution, and this image has 68 layers. So this resembles pretty much a typical composite that I would do. So we've seen that this can handle some basic tasks very, very well. But let's look and see if it can even handle these large composites that typically I'm running the 64 gig MacBook Pro here, or running it on the Mac Pro. And as far as testing it to see how long it would take to open, the 16-inch MacBook Pro opened this in 15 seconds. The M1 was actually able to open it. It took 25 seconds. And if we ran it on Rosetta, it took 36 seconds to run it. And just to test, I opened it on a 12-core Mac Pro and it took 15.65. So it's actually a little bit slower than the 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is not surprising because on my previous test, Photoshop, a lot of tasks run better on a 16-inch MacBook Pro than on that big Mac Pro. Now, of course, the reason I got the big Mac Pro was for video encoding and rendering, which it does much faster than all the other machines. So we're taking those 68 layers and creating a composite layer or a stamp visible of all of those layers. On the 16-inch MacBook Pro, it took 3 seconds. On the 13-inch M1, it took 6 seconds. So twice as fast, but still very snappy and able to work. Okay, so let's run a filter on that layer, and we're running a smart blur, which is quite difficult, a radius of 50, threshold 25 on high quality. The 16-inch took 54 seconds. The 13-inch M1, 56 seconds, so almost as fast. So that means we can run filters on that large image almost as fast. Then we decided to do something a little bit tougher. Let's do a flip horizontal on this entire document. The 16-inch MacBook Pro, 12.47 seconds. The M1, 48.93 seconds. And running on Rosetta, it took 1 minute and 8 seconds. All right, so at this point here, I know this thing's running out of memory and that's why it's struggling. And it's almost not fair to do this test, but we've already looked at the lighter weight files. We know this runs as good, if not better than the 16-inch. So why don't we just continue and push it now at this point? Let's just see what it can take. So what I decided to do is resize this image by 300% and just create this massive file that technically a machine running only 8 gigs of memory should not even be able to load. And that's shared memory. Remember, the video and the RAM are sharing that same memory. All right, so let's do it. So we decided to go to 300% bicubic, which is a more difficult algorithm. And this takes this to a whopping 28K image. So it's 28,000 by 17,000 pixels. I rounded it by just a little bit. Plus, it has smart filters, and there's different layers of those smart filters all have to be re-rendered. So it has to re-render all of these. So this is a beast of a file that we're creating right now. I decided to do a stamp visible again on this image that is now 3 times as large, this massive image. The 16-inch MacBook Pro Intel was able to do it in 41 seconds. The M1 13-inch, 55 seconds. So even with this massive file, it was still able to work there in that layer stack and be almost as quick. Running on Rosetta, it took a little longer, 1 minute and 11 seconds. Now, just for fun, I ran that on the Mac Pro, and the Mac Pro did this in an astounding 15 seconds. So that particular task, it just really excelled. So right now, this little guy's boxing with some pretty heavyweight players. All right, so the next thing I did on all of the tests, I purged all for obvious reasons. If I didn't do that, then just everything would come to screaming halt. That just clears out the memory, keeps that file loaded, but clears out the saves and different things like that, and enables me to continue working. And then decided to apply this Radial Blur at 100% and good quality zooming in. So this is one of those filters that's really, really hard and heavy. Bear in mind that we have this image that's 28K, but it also has 68 layers. This is a huge file. In the past, any machine, with even 16 gigs of RAM, I would try to run a filter on there. It would give me an out of memory error message. So let's just see if we can even handle it. And yes, it did. Now, don't for a second think it was going to beat the 16-inch with 64 gigs, because it's not, because this thing right now has reached the limit of its memory. So let me tell you the specs, speeds we've got here. So when we apply this blur, the 16-inch MacBook Pro was around 36 seconds, which was about the same time as the 12-core Mac Pro. Let's see how fast the M1 13-inch can do that. So we're going to choose Filter, Blur, Radial Blur. Let's set that to zoom 100%, good quality. And let's get the stopwatch started on my iPhone and go. Wow. Okay, it didn't beat out the 16-inch with the blur at that size, but it performed it in 1 minute and 6 seconds. If you compare the specs on this machine to this machine, that's truly amazing. This it? All right, so then we've got this huge file, and why don't we see how long it takes to save this file? So on the 16-inch MacBook Pro, it took 4 minutes and 14 seconds to save that file. The Mac Pro took 3 minutes and 44 seconds. And then the M1 doing the Photoshop beta was 5 minutes and 2 seconds. So a little bit longer, but it's still able to do it. And then as far as doing it on Rosetta, it failed because the file was so big, I ran out of space and literally did not have enough space, which is really interesting. So that means while it's working, Photoshop takes more space on the Rosetta version than it does while it's working on that same file inside the optimized M1. Now, the 16-inch, the fan was running pretty hot. On this 13-inch, the fan was barely working. I felt underneath and it was still cool. It was slightly warm, but not even warm like it's been sitting on my lap. It was actually cooler than that. So I decided, well, what if I can, with this huge file open, what if I can play a 4K video? So I took DJI 4K and started playing it back in preview, and it was not dropping any frames. So I thought, I wonder if I can run a YouTube video at the same time. So I played a YouTube video. That was still going. And this is, remember, this huge file loaded inside of Photoshop and Photoshop running. So I launched another window in Safari and launched a second YouTube video. Then I launched another window inside of Safari and ran a third YouTube video. Then I went back to the 4K preview of the video. It was still playing smoothly without dropping any frame. All right, so I gotta say, I'm really impressed what I could see on this 13-inch. So what does that mean? Is it time for you to rush out like some people are panic selling their 16-inch? No, I wouldn't do that, because there's a couple of things you got to bear in mind. One is the Photoshop version is still in beta, so a lot of those key features are not there, and they will be coming. However, running it on Rosetta, it seems that Photoshop 2021 seems to work really well. Camera Raw seems to work well. For your average photographer, regular photographer, person traveling, doing lighter work, doing editing, some retouching, this machine is going to do the job. And purely we're talking about Photoshop here. Now, where the limitation comes, obviously, is because of memory. So if you're doing composites and you're working with multi-layered files, large panoramas, or those larger files, you would best be served to wait until they come out with a version with more memory, maybe 32 gigs or even 64 gigs. And I just want to be very clear, even though this 13-inch is able to load up these big, huge files and run some filters in there, it's not fast enough for it to actually be workable. So things like panning, very, very slow, sluggish. Things like brushing would be almost impossible. So it's not enough performance for me to perform work when I have files that large in there. Whereas the 16-inch MacBook Pro is built for that with, obviously that extra memory. So the memory is the limitation at the moment. So I will be testing the 16 gig version as soon as I can get my hands on it. And also, if you prefer the bigger screen, you might want to wait for them to make the flagship version into the 16-inch MacBook Pro and perhaps the iMac as well, or the iMac Pro. So it's going to be interesting to see where this is going. This is the very first version, and I've got to say, for a version 1, this is a great kickoff. I'm super excited to see where Apple's going with silicon. I really do believe it's going to be a game changer. So anyway, guys, what would you like to see me test? I'm going to do some other tests with Lightroom and some video tests, exporting, imports, different things like that. Drop in the comments. Let me know what you'd like to see me test next. This video is specifically on Photoshop. And by the way, if you're new here to Photoshop Cafe, first of all, warm welcome. Glad to have you with us. Hit that subscribe button and you're going to get a new Photoshop tutorial from me every single week. And by the way, guys, if you like this, smash the like button into dust. And until next time, I'll see you at the cafe.